Thank you for joining us for this episode of Queer at Age. It's recorded as part of 30 years of activism from the Rainbow Project as they celebrate their 30th year as a service to the community. And in this episode, we are talking with Duane Farrell, who used to work with the Rainbow Project back in 1984. And it's going to tell us what it was like back then and give us a wee bit of insight into some memories of his time with Rainbow Project. Hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone. Very welcome to join us on this podcast. I'm Joe Waltz from the LGBTQIA+ Heritage Project, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Duane Farrell. Hi, Duane. Very welcome. Thank you for...
Hey Joe, how are you? Thanks a million for having me. Love the work you're doing with the Heritage Project.
Brilliant. So we're keen to get a few pointers from you from back in the day. You're going to take us back to about 1998.
Yeah,
That was when you first got involved with the Rainbow Project.
that's 100% right. And you can tell from the accent, Joe, that I am originally a dub. But I suppose through my time in third level education, I'd gotten involved in Students' Union and in what was then the LGB movement. There wasn't a lot of visibility for our brothers and sisters from the trans community. So yes, and through that, even though what I studied was hotel management, we I knew what put a fire in my belly at that point in time was working in the community and a particular passion in and around HIV prevention. And that's where Rainbow's roots really lay in those early years was it came out of the HIV epidemic at the time. And I remember at that point in time reading some of the early figures and facts around Rainbow's establishment in 1994. I think at that point in time, 70% of infections, HIV infections in Northern Ireland, were being transmitted sexually between men. And there wasn't a single kind of targeted education program, prevention program, outreach program. And that's where Tom McManus, David McCartney, Aidan Vaughan, people like that came together and developed the community response that was Rainbow. Um, I my sorry, go on ahead, Joe.
No problem. Duane, that was the time when we had all of those scary adverts on the TV with the tombstones and the AIDS don't die of ignorance and all of that.
Yeah,
So,
and even that ad still stays with me today. And it's fascinating to watch. I think Norman Fowler was the Minister for Health talking about how he had to push to get that campaign done and to try and educate people, but also just the amount of stigma for people living with HIV that resulted from that campaign. And that is, it's not gone. Stigma of people living with HIV face isn't gone, but we have traveled some distance in that regard.
absolutely. So other than that campaign, there was no information. You couldn't like go to the doctors for a leaflet or talk to anybody, and that's how the kind of the Rainbow Project came about.
Yeah. Not only could you not, people weren't out. I grew up in the South, also where religious aspects controlled the public debate and controlled public acceptance. And that meant that LGBT people felt isolated, didn't feel comfortable outing themselves to health professionals, to medical professionals. And it was the same up north. But yeah, there was, I suppose, and I've heard these stories. At the time, they got together for a 6-month project, and it was an action research project. And that action research was going out into bars and clubs and giving out through volunteers safer sex packs. So that was condoms and lube, and training up those volunteers to be equipped to answer questions for people. And that through that, they were also passing out surveys that was building a kind of baseline understanding of what knowledge did people have about HIV and how to protect themselves? Where did they go to support? And what emerged out of that for Rainbow was a very clear sense that people felt more comfortable talking to other gay people around it. They had a greater degree of trust, I suppose, in the LGBT community to understand their specific needs, to kind of approach the thing in a traditional, what we would call health promotion way. So not judging the individual, but giving them accurate information. And that, what was a 6-month action research project, is now 30 years later, the amazing work of Rainbow. And over that time, it has focused from being a move focus from being a gay and bisexual men's organization focused on HIV to being an organization that represents full breadth of the community, and that, you know, moves beyond just the health approach into policy, into influence, and all of those things.
It certainly has grown, absolutely. So, Duane, what was your role when you first got involved? Were you one of the ones who were on the ground? Were you out in the bars talking to people and giving out the packs and stuff?
So I joined Rainbow in August '98, and the title of the role I worked in was rural project worker. So it was a program that was funded by the National Lottery, I think it was called back then, not the Community Fund or National Lottery Community Fund. It was just a lottery project that was really saw Northern Ireland in two terms, the Greater Belfast area, and I had a colleague, Gary, who covered the Greater Belfast area, and then everything outside Greater Belfast was rural project worker, and that was me. And the initial focus for that was primarily the Northwest, as the really kind of only other space where there was an organized community for us to be able to work through. So the organization Rainbow didn't have offices back at that point in time in the Northwest in Foyle. But we were lucky enough that our colleagues in Foyle Friend gave us some space there to be able to meet volunteers, to be able to meet service users. And of course, the people may recognize the name, the Martin McConaughey, who I just saw last Saturday at Oma Pride. Martin McConaughey ran the once a week night at the Guidor. He was the DJ. And Derry's scene at that point in time was a Thursday night in the Guidor. So Martin and I would often meet before that and plot how would we get good information out to members of the community, what we were going to do for World AIDS Day, how we could support volunteers. So yeah, my initial work was always outside of Belfast. The Northwest took up a lot of that, but I was down. We had volunteers in Armagh, we had volunteers out in Fermanagh, and able to kind of work with a whole group of people outside the Belfast area who were trying to do things in small ways in their own community to support people.
And so the scene, as it was called back then, it was a one night a week. There was no sort of dedicated gay bars as such. It was one night somewhere where you were lucky enough to,
Yeah.
and it was probably never a weekend.
No, well, it was. I didn't make McGee. McGee lives in legend that on a Saturday night, every Saturday night, historically, the Students' Union in McGee held a gay night, a gay disco. And that priest that was there before the Guidor. It fell away. Martin took up the space during the Guidor, but I do still remember. I'm going to say it was around 2000 when Derry got its first full time space, and I think if I'm not right, I think it was called Saints and Sinners in its first incarnation. It was on Strand Road, opposite the Strand Road police station there. I think it changed name about three times over its ownership. But the excitement in the city, you know, to be getting a full time gay venue, what that meant in terms of throughout the week, not only in terms of, you know, obviously it was a commercial space, it was a bar and a club, so people could go partying, but just as a safe space for people to meet outside of the kind of partying element of it. So yeah, interesting times.
Yes, and as usual, we put out a wee call if anybody's listening who was there back in the day. If you've any photographs or specific memories of the time, we'd love to hear from you because we have the online community archive, and we know photographs are very rare from them those days because everybody didn't have a phone in their pocket.
You used to have to bring your film to the shop to get developed.
Yes, and a lot of people probably weren't out, so there was that.
Yes. Yeah, yeah,
So Dwayne, would women have used those spaces as well? Would there have been lesbians in with gay men mixing?
100% in the commercial spaces, while Rainbow's focus was gay and bisexual men. There were some amazing people who were part of that journey. There's a brilliant story. World AIDS Day was a big focus for the organization back then. And there was an artist in the Northwest, a woman called Mary Tudor, MT. And MT was a force of nature. She didn't take any crap from anybody. And there was a debate what we were going to do on World AIDS Day in Guildhall Square. And I landed up, I think, the week before. And Mary was really excited to show me that she had built this kind of 6 foot red ribbon. It was 6 foot high. It was probably about 3 foot wide, and it looked brilliant. But how we were going to use it, and I said, "What are we going to do about this?" And Mary says, "You leave it with me." And I come up the next week, and as I arrived in Guildhall Square, though there was that red ribbon. It was cut out of wood and painted, and she had crawled out on one of the cannons that leant over the walls of Derry with no permission from anybody and tied the red ribbon off that. So it was a focal point as you stood in Guildhall Square. So there, and Mary MT was just one of the people who were, you know, doing amazing things to help the battle against HIV. While in the Northwest, I worked with, Grania Close, who was working in Foyle Friend at the time, Caroline McClure, to run campaigns regularly, in the bars and the clubs and spaces. So, that story, it's always been, of course, there are exclusions to that, and there are spaces where perhaps women, lesbians didn't feel comfortable, but there was a lot of work that was done in partnership in the community at that point in time as well.
Brilliant. And none of the money was coming from local government or the health service. This was all from organizations like lottery funding and
So we had done some early work, and to be fair, actually, the health promotion units in what was the old health and social services boards were the people who were funding some of that work. It wasn't huge amounts of money, to be perfectly honest, at that point in time, and it wasn't enough. My role was funded through the lottery, but the purchase of condoms, the delivery of some of those kind of resources, information resources into the community, were funded by some of the Health and Social Services Board, who were taking a little bit of um, challenge from the more conservative elements in our society, the fact that they were funding this work when all of the evidence pointed people towards you had to engage those communities directly affected if we're serious. And it was interesting because actually it's one of the earliest pieces of work I remember in Rainbow in about 19 late 98, or no, it was 1999, I would say, as that lottery project was coming to an end and we didn't see a kind of line of sight into other funding. We decided, myself and the then manager, a guy called Adrian McCracken, to do some lobbying in Stormont. And Stormont had just been established. We just had elected MLAs and kind of health committees, and we took a day up, and we met with three, if definitely three, and maybe a fourth party met with us to discuss. And I remember working with Adrian on a briefing which indicated that the lifetime costs for somebody living with HIV across medication, across benefits, across a range of areas of their life, the lifetime cost to the system was about £130,000 over one person's lifetime. Therefore, funding to stop one person, funding of 20 grand to stop one person contracting HIV was going to be cost effective. And we felt that was a very compelling argument. I remember meeting with Joe Hendren, who was from the SDLP, agreed to meet with us and gave us a fair hearing. Sinn Féin met with us. It was Sue Ramsey from West Belfast. And the only of the unionist parties who met with us was the Progressive Unionist Party. And it was David Irvine and Dawn Purvis who gave us a really fair hearing. Unfortunately, it didn't translate at that point in time into increased funding, but I think it did increase awareness of, started to build political relationships for Rainbow Project and increased awareness around what it is we were trying to do from a health perspective.
wow. So that was a struggle to get people on board, particularly the politicians, and you're more or less doing the work for them. So so they couldn't really say no because you were coming
Yes.
with the problem and the solutions, and
Yes.
um So interesting times.
Yeah.
So do you remember any backlash in the media, the papers, or anything the politicians were saying openly against the community at the time, or
Well, I suppose we had the traditional kind of there was, I think it's fair to say, a community divide where more unionist leaning parties have a history of being less accepting of, homosexuality, alternative sexualities. So you would find, I think there were a couple of instances where, was there a Mr. Gay NI event in the Parliament that the Free Presbyterian Church picketed? Um, there was, so yeah, there were very clear instances where politicians were sticking the boot into gay homosexual men, into the LGBT community, um, and some of that work was very difficult to do. I remember in, I want to say 2003, 2004, when we started the debate on hate crime. And Niagara, P.A. McLaughlin and Jeff Dudgeon have been doing sterling work to say, you needed to include homophobia as an aggravating factor in any hate crime legislation. But it would have been 2004 because it was under direct rule. And the Northern Ireland office launched a consultation where they were consulting on sectarian and racist related hate crime. And the campaign was to say you can't bring forward hate crime on those grounds and not countenance the fact that homophobia is very clearly a ground on which people in communities are facing violence, verbal violence, actual violence. We did a piece of research, and in the previous 10 years leading up to that, so from about, no, maybe in 14 years, I think from about 1990, we identified at least 8 men who had been murdered as a result of their sexual orientation. At the time, we've come a long way in terms of the work with police service, in terms of recording of hate crimes. But even at that stage, there wasn't a huge degree of trust across the police service and members of the community to go in and report. So you didn't necessarily have a huge amount of data to be able to say, here are the volumes of it. But we knew people were in Rainbow day and daily talking about the homophobia they experienced in their communities while walking in the street. Um, my first Belfast Pride was 1999, and the what Belfast Pride looks like now compared to what Belfast Pride looked like then is very different. People were shouting at you, people were spitting at you as you were walking up Royal Avenue. So we've come a long way, but yeah, that was the lived experience was less positive back then, Joe.
thank you for tuning in to the Queer Heritage podcast series. We are kindly funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and in partnership with Here and I, Cara Friend, and the Rainbow Project. If you would like to make a donation to our work, simply scan the QR code on your screen, or you can visit localgiving.org/charity/Here and I. That sounds horrendous compared to what it was now. And thankfully it's changing. We still have a bit of a way to go. And the organizations do try and build relationships with the police. And of course now we have the hate crime advocacy officer on board in Rainbow, which is a game changer.
Phenomenal role, and the work that happens there to support people is brilliant.
Do you remember where the Rainbow Project was situated at the time in Belfast?
Yes, I do. They were situated on Church Lane, so it's right at the top of Church Lane. Back then, I think it's now called Bootleggers, a bar called Bootleggers at the top of Church Lane. Just at the junction with Ann Street, it used to be a bar called the Roost, and we were facing that. I think from about a year before I joined, so probably about 1996, 97, they had moved there. They had historically been co-located with what's called the AIDS Helpline. Back from its kind of early days in 1994, they shared a space with the AIDS Helpline on Mount Charles, just off University Road there, and latterly on James Street South. So yeah, very good. And that was a big drive back then, was that the city centre was potentially a more neutral space for people to come into an office like the Rainbow Project. They felt perhaps a bit more comfortable. So having the office somewhere that was neutral and was accessible to people from all sides of the community in Northern Ireland was really important. Um, Church Lane City Centre was lovely, and then I discovered it was I came from Dublin, Joe, and I had never countenanced the idea that bars would be daytime enterprises, but the Roost right across the road opened at 10 o'clock and shut at 5 o'clock. It was a daytime bar. I'd never seen anything like it, but that was also just another indication of what the city was like at that point in time, and the city with the kind of uh, you know, everybody came into work, went home, and it was really the LGBT community who would have used the city centre at night time to come into places like the Parliament, the Crow's Nest. But a lot of people just exited the city at that point in time.
And was that the time, Duane, when there were still the checkpoints and
I missed the checkpoints. I think the checkpoints were a couple of years before they've been gotten rid of, but I still think people didn't feel safe in the city centre. So I think a lot of that kind of, that people were still concerned about coming into the city centre in the way they would have been when the checkpoints were there.
so it was 5 o'clock was the cutoff point for the bars and the social scene? Well,
absolutely. Well, for the non-LGBT social scene, but no, Crow's Nest, the Parliament would have